banca para adaptarnos a los nuevos tiempos, reinventarnos, desaparecer para crear un nuevo sistema moderno y eficaz que ya se entiende por todas partes.
Hello, welcome to the SCI-Arc Channel. My name's Joe Day, and I'm here tonight speaking with Barbara Bestor. Barbara and I overlapped a little bit at SCI-Arc, and both of us came back, or in my case, back to Los Angeles and yours to LA in the early 90s. It was an interesting time here, and I was wondering what your specific reasons for the move were. What brought you west?
I am a child of the East Coast and a fairly academic background, and I had a fairly academic undergraduate experience as well. But I took some time off and went to England to the AA in the late 80s. And while I was there, Alvin Boyarsky, the esteemed dean of the AA, said, well, if you're gonna go back to the US, which you shouldn't, but if you are, do not go back to the East Coast, go to California. And it was a time, I mean, I knew a little bit about what was going on. It's when Frank Gehry's Nelson House was on the cover of the Architecture Review, which was kind of a house for a writer that kind of mimics a lifeguard shack, kind of projected over the boardwalk. Just radical, fun, weird stuff. And I thought, well, you know, I would like to see what it's like out there. So that's how I ended up coming out to LA and to SCI-Arc specifically, because that was the direction I was pointed to by my European radical architecture cohort.
We overlapped in the early 90s actually in a seminar here as you were completing school, and I was just getting a sense for it. But Mike Davis was a common instructor of ours, and I was thinking about Los Angeles at that time, and in the early 90s there was, I think, a sense of impending change in LA. And I'm wondering what you found kind of inspiring on arrival, and what led you to stay and establish your practice here?
Well, I mean, I think you're right that there was both sort of natural disasters, like there was a pretty big earthquake, you know, the Northridge earthquake, and we also had you know, a civil rights riot in those days. And the city was sort of in a state of questioning itself, and the architecture crowd that would have been our teachers' generation, I think were what they now call the LA School, the kind of Gehry, early Morphosis, Moss, et cetera, who were kind of gritty urban designers of somewhat sculptural forms. And so I think the question that we had was like, well, what is that is that the architecture for the people? Like, to me, that still resonates. Like, what am I gonna do about it? Like, where does architecture fit in?
It's funny, you're sort of children of the counter-revolution with Mike Davis and Margaret Crawford, and I think an interesting period of kind of reassessment of the LA School. I feel like, and we've talked about this before, that we're probably children of both moments in some ways, but I'm wondering if you feel like your practice built on one strain of thought more than the other, maybe.
Well, I would say that my architecture demigods were probably more, I mean, I actually was rather fond of the Gehry project at that time. Also, I loved stuff like Alvar Aalto, and Peter Zumthor was around a bunch. It was a very eclectic mix. So I think that the way that we think about what architecture means might have been heavily influenced by that group, but what architecture is or looks like or feels wasn't particularly influenced by that. A lot of our training was to be designers, and I always liked that we had critical training, you know, even questioning the nature of design. And its relationship to late capitalism, so that we didn't just kind of go out there going like, design is everything no matter what. You know, actually we're like, oh, it's complicated. Architecture is complicated, who it's for, who pays for it, et cetera. So knowing that is really important. I guess how it relates to sort of aesthetics and the bigger question of like what architecture is made of or what it looks like is kind of more like what a lot of us deal with on an individual basis.
It seems in your practice like there's a sort of simultaneity of considering those larger questions and making immediate serious use of them. I mean, I was struck looking through the work, Barbara, at just how many problems you solve. At any given moment, you're really taking on projects of an incredible scale of engagement. In Beats, there are a lot of 2D codings of 3D spaces, bleed into one another, but stay discrete as they need to.
The architectural moves that are, say, structural are very big. There's like big cuts in an existing building, like pretty major restructuring, natural light, et cetera. But then I think the idea is that, in a sense, neutrality is a trap when you're working on something at that scale. The idea is, how do you introduce difference and, let's say, atmospheric variation? But then also, like, I've always been interested in this sort of more like sensorial idea of atmosphere, like color, different kinds of jobs. You know, this is a tech/music business company, so some of it's like flashy. There's people who are literally on the phone all night long moving shipping containers in Southeast Asia from point A to point B. They want peace and calm. They want like a controlled light environment. And then you have like a marketing department with another 200 people who are like, let's play music, and they're kind of like, we want an art school. So how do you trying to essentially create an urban condition as an interior? You want to give everyone what they need, but also how do you do the social engineering circulation thing where you're creating a lot of places where you would help the company by having people cross paths.
The installation you did in the SCI-Arc Gallery, Silent Disco, it was a fantastic installation in which images are superimposed into a surface that then becomes this kind of origami-like environment. You developed an entire spatial vocabulary within that space that seems both related to beats and sort of apart from it in terms of the actual latitude you had in shaping space.
It's intentionally creating what I call sort of the disco floor. So that is like the collage, heavy stimulus, couple different layers, mirrors, etc. This sort of central public mixer space, but it also had all this leftover space that was also intentionally like not that, like it kind of was a pink lit, there's beds and like little ladders and kind of like little inhabitations for students. And the bigger concept though is that, which I have comes through in a lot of projects, is how do we as architects making a space or an installation compete with like the draw of the screen?
The documentation of your project is sort of wonderfully crowded. There's always a figure, and you sort of need a figure because the scaling is crucial. I'd love to talk with you about your houses, actually.
In my own experience, and actually starting out, frankly, in school, sort of doing like feminist critiques of domestic arrangements as being often, very much encoded power structures and stuff. So I kind of think about that a bit when I'm working on my own places, not so much in a super didactic way. Rather than taking things for granted that they should be like this because the real estate market says so, what are ways of doing this that are actually like beneficial in other ways? So I kind of find like circulation and like where the line between private and public is kind of has shifted for me depending on situations.
I'm really attached to the floating pavilion. That to me relates to your first comment about Gary's Nelson project. It's certainly a hovering coastal volume. And then the Glendower project, which I was reminded when I went and looked at it today, has an interesting neighbor, but also I think a real sense of its own formal confidence and it's a small project with a lot of really beautifully, a few moves made beautifully.
Both of those projects did come out of really strong context. So the floating bungalow, is kind of a slightly sculptural commentary on the Venice walk streets and the sort of disappearance of the bungalow on those streets. So the bungalow becomes like a ghost shape that kind of rises up, and the ground floor is the public space is open, and it's sort of essentially a plinth for the floating Joel Shapiro-esque ghost of a bungalow. The Glendower house is on a crazy hillside right below the super enormous Ennis house, which is so wonderful because it's super enormous and yet it has like essentially a one-bedroom little like penthouse apartment inside of it. It was one of the first times I got to explore the legacy of, say, the View house, like a house on a hill. Those views that are kind of, where it's all about transparency. And then to me the question was, how do you, what is the procession from arriving at something like that to actually getting into that view? I like sections, and circulation would be way up there.
I feel like a lot of our friendship has been based on the discussion of how art and architecture relate both in LA and more broadly. Could you talk about one artist that's made a real difference in how you approach your work?
I guess someone who I feel like a lot of kinship with, say, in the LA art world would be someone like Julian Hober, who kind of looks at things like, say, the legacy of Donald Judd, or the phenomenon of the mystery spots, which are kind of like roadside attractions, and kind of brings them together and turns them into this totally other experience. It's sort of a phenomenal experience, like taking some of the detritus of our popular culture, high and low, and turning it into like an actual very heightened experience. Like that's kind of what I'm interested in. So I guess more so than like some of the relational aesthetic stuff, which is more to do with like conversation and stuff, and there isn't as much making of something. Like I'm pretty interested in like making the thing and maybe like controlling that space a little more. So a lot of the artwork that I'm interested in is often about like color or material or transparency, but I would say like that's kind of a good example of work that I'm interested in. I kind of identify more as like kind of in the architecture art like borderline category.
Barbara, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk.
This was so fun. Thank you very much.
Para adaptarnos a los nuevos tiempos, reinventarnos, desaparecer para crear un nuevo sistema moderno y eficaz.